Welcome to our podcast, Our Story to Tell, where we share our life behind the scenes of moving our family abroad and how that move changed everything for us.
We're Rissa and Tanner, an American family living life abroad with our two little adventurers. From the US to Germany, Japan, and now Italy, this podcast is more than just travel. It's a story of transformation too.
Everyone has a story, and this is ours, and maybe parts of it will sound a little bit like yours too. With that, let's get started.
Today's episode is like the long-awaited for one. This is where we're going to be sharing our thoughts and feelings and our reasons for our departure from the Mormon church.
We're excited to really share more of those specific details because they've been very personal for us.
Yeah, and we're going to start off this podcast with another disclaimer. We did this on episode 8 where we talked about our Mormon faith shift. I will just read it word for word because we did take quite a bit of time thinking about it. Before we begin, we want to share a quick note for our listeners, especially those who are active or believing members of the LDS Church. Some of what we will discuss in this episode may challenge truths you hold a firm belief in, and we may share historical information or truth claims that you were previously unaware of. In fact, much of this new information is what ultimately contributed to our metaphorical shelves breaking. This episode is not meant to convince, deconvert, or attack anyone's faith. We're simply sharing our personal experiences and the information that shaped our journey. We believe that informed consent matters, especially when it comes to organizations, belief systems, and commitments that ask for so much of our time, trust, and identity. For us, learning more wasn't about rebellion. It was about honesty and integrity. So, from that perspective, we do believe that there is value in understanding the true history of the LDS Church, including some of the most foundational truths behind the restoration of the church we all know of today, things that are not always openly discussed. That said, we also deeply respect that timing matters. If you're not in a place where you want to engage with information that could challenge your beliefs, or if hearing about faith transitions feels overwhelming or unsafe right now, this may not be the right episode for you, and that's okay. We honor that everyone's spiritual path is different. We know that belief still feels true for a lot of people, and we respect that. For us, though, the world became too big, too diverse, and too beautiful to fit inside that box anymore. Our hope is simply to share our story with integrity and care and to hold space for thoughtful, respectful listening. So, with that, let's dive in.
For those of you who listened to episode 8, that was our beginning of our faith expansion, is what we kind of frequently commented and called it like that. So, to recap a little bit, let's jump into some of those topics that we covered.
Real quick though, let's set the stage because that's really important. The context matters. So we both grew up in very religious, Orthodox families and communities. We started attending primary from a really young age, absorbed all the information, believed it fully. We were the type of high schoolers that were waking up early on like a late start morning to go do baptisms for the dead in the temple. Tanner served an LDS church mission right after high school. He got back and we got engaged like 2 months after he returned home. So I was 19, he was 20. And at this point, we have checked off so many of the boxes that kind of are like the foundational things you need to do within the Mormon religion to enter into the temple. Then we got sealed in the LDS temple in Logan, Utah. Little young babies.
Yeah, and life, didn't stop from there. We both continued to pursue careers and were successful in college. Really, that's when our careers started taking off, and I was able to get my first full-time job and worked there for 2 years, and then life drastically changed for us. For one, we had a child. Our oldest was born during the first year of my job, and then I got a job overseas in Germany. So the whole premise of us having the experience that we've had was really built upon us moving abroad. Everything kind of shifted and shaped us from there.
Mm-hmm. And episode 8 kind of picks up once we land in Germany. We start noticing a lot of differences between German families and the way that we were raised. It did naturally bring questions.
Yeah, and a lot of those questions ultimately began to try and understand better our faith, try to deepen our faith and our relationship with our religion. Unfortunately, as we were trying to do this strengthening, there was some bumps in the road, if you want to call them, uncomfortable pieces of information and things that we weren't aware of.
I'm smiling because you said bumps in the road, but for me, it was like a huge crash in the road. You were going to listen to podcasts from active Mormon members that we're just asking some of those more difficult questions that are totally valid, because some of the Mormon theology does raise questions. So you were trying to seek answers to like strengthen your testimony. You did not expect what we found. And that was like a huge moment.
We were navigating what we kind of identified and what other people have identified as like the gray space. So much of what we were taught was quite black and white thinking. And so as we're going through these gray spaces, this is where we're finding out new information about the church's gospel topic essays, about differences in what we were taught about the Book of Mormon, the translation, eventually onto more current cases with like the financial statements, the SEC filings, sexual abuse cases. There was a lot of heavy hitters. And yeah, they were bigger than bumps in the road. The metaphor maybe wasn't the best, but they were bumps, and they caused us to do even deeper reflection. That was a big part of the struggle, was trying to identify what felt authentic to us, following the morals and values that we had been taught, and what ultimately felt like what was going to be the path forward for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we highly recommend you guys go and listen to that podcast episode, because there's even more to it. I mean, we talk about the first vision, polygamy, and then I talk about my struggle with LGBTQ and with garments. So it's definitely the episode that we would refer you to if you're interested in any of those topics. And it does just really set the stage for where we're going to pick up here in this episode.
Right before we had left Germany, there came to a point where we share in this episode that I kind of admitted to myself and admitted to you out loud that I could not see myself having the same relationship and continuing to be in the church at that point. Like, that's the feeling that I had. And I didn't know what that meant as far as timeline, or what that meant even for a relationship. But that's not where the story had ended. That's honestly just like another chapter of where it was. And we didn't make any conclusions. We didn't make any decisions. We were trying to take it slowly, and we were trying to navigate through all those feelings rather than making rash decisions to be definitive with something.
Yeah, I feel like when you said that, it was you expressing out loud that we were changing. And I feel like in Norway, it's where we really kind of like shed those old layers and versions of us and really stepped into who we were becoming. It felt a bit frightening, but also peaceful and nice. I'm already getting a little emotional to just recognize, that it was okay to change. Yeah, we're different, but felt like we were on a path to a more authentic version of us. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost the exact words that I would say. We just wanted to take a minute or two to talk about some of the feedback, some of the comments. The majority of them were really kind and honestly just kind of sympathized with us, and also commended us for sharing our story. And it honestly felt really nice to hear so much support and love. And then, of course, on the other side, there were people also sharing their experiences of how they've loved staying in like religion and church. And, of course, even a little bit further than that, we're maybe criticizing our decisions. And like, that's okay. Like, we know that what we made, the decision that we made, was best for us. But we just wanted to say thank you for those who did comment, especially for those who are supporting us. It means a lot.
Yeah, it felt like a big, nice, warm hug, even if we're landing on totally different, places. That's what I love about it, is like, we don't have to have the same beliefs. I don't know. There's so many good people out there, and you guys are those people. So
now that we've ended out that recap there, jumping into this episode, which is going to be talking about our move to Japan.
Yeah, so spiritually, we're in this place where everything kind of feels a bit unknown. And not just spiritually, but physically, we just moved to Japan.
As we explained in our last episode, the move to Japan was hard, and it came with an internal battle of what was best for our family. We had decided when we left Germany that we weren't going to tell our church, specifically the city, the location that we were going to, with the intent that we were hoping that our church records wouldn't be sent with us. Now, a little context, the LDS Church does a phenomenal job of keeping the Ward family, per se, all connected. So if someone moves, the leadership tries to get the address and the location so that when they move, they have an instant family there. Mm-hmm. And we honestly love that. We really loved moving to Germany, moving to Southern California, moving to other areas that we did, and having an instant family with a church community. But our intention with this move was try to experience life for a time outside of the LDS theology, going to church, and like the pressure that comes with being an inactive member. We wanted to give it a try, and so it worked out. And when we moved to Japan, they knew we were going to Japan, but they assumed that we were moving with the army. And so our records, a few months later, I think like 6 months into Japan, they got sent to an army base an hour or two away from where we were.
So up until this point, our childhoods, even in Germany, not going to church, like consciously making that decision, came with a bit of guilt. Because growing up in high demand religion, absence is never neutral. At least it wasn't in our case. When we made this decision, it was definitely intentional, like you said, and it felt both big and small. It was just nice. We were giving ourselves space, and I feel like we were really listening to what we needed, what our minds, our bodies needed. And I mean, we were just adjusting to a new country. So even not going, in a sense, was just giving us space to adjust. You know?
And I would say that it also was giving like our spiritual side kind of a break that we needed. We were still trying to find ways to become more in tune with like our intuition and like our strengthening our morals and values and like our love and our marriage. Honestly, we were still trying in so many ways to connect to so many of those same values that we practiced in church, but stepping away from like a physical institution of doing so. And I feel like you said, it honestly felt freeing in so many ways, but it also was a good kind of like test to see how it ultimately felt internally.
Yeah, I definitely remember thinking this was like a trial period. I honestly felt like there was a chance that we could have started attending again. And I remember the first time we started exploring Yokosuka on foot, we were, filming a YouTube video, getting our first impressions, and we stumbled upon the LDS church building.
Yeah, it was like the second or third floor of like this big business complex, so like a very atypical. There was actually a church with like a cross across the street. It was like a physical church building that you could identify. But then here up, a couple floors up, there was like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sign. It was like extremely close to work. It was quite close to where we lived. But yeah, I mean, this time it was kind of like a resting phase where we were going to be physically outside of like the institution, like of the LDS church, while also giving us time to breathe and time for us to navigate this new territory without just immediately replacing it with like another church. Because we both talked about it. We're like, I think going to another Christian-based church and experiencing that is something that was definitely in like our foresight. And at the same time, we are also recognizing many things that we'll talk about in the episode today that were directly connected with just organized religion in general. So as you mentioned before, Christmas was a very busy time as we were just getting settled in. So it wasn't that hard to celebrate Christmas without like the church community and without a lot of the typical traditions that go with it. But I will say that a few months later, when it came to Easter time, that's when you started at least expressing and recognizing some of like the struggle to not having that community.
Yeah, I felt the loss of not celebrating the resurrection with like-minded Christians, other individuals. It was at this point in March and April where, in general, we were kind of on a low from the honeymoon phase, which we call it, of like moving to a new country. Everything's so exciting, everything's so great. And then you kind of like hit a lower moment where we talked about in the last episode of like, crap, what did we do? So we're in this moment and Easter comes. I'm just feeling the void of not attending church. It's been at least 6 months at this point where we haven't physically attended, starting to feel like a loss. I feel like I wasn't just grieving the church attendance, but it was like the ritual that came with it, really just like the shared language of something people consider spiritual. So it's in this moment when I'm realizing how deeply Mormonism has shaped my spiritual framework. Like, that makes sense. I was an Orthodox, true-believing member, but I'm questioning it. And it's still the lens which I'm still thinking of. It's like Easter is like, I only know it through Mormonism, so not having the Mormonism aspect, I'm like, I don't know. I'm feeling a little lost, there's
definitely this like internal conflict where you're trying to balance stepping away from some of the structural theology and the structural belief system within the Mormon theology, while also still trying to tap into like the Christian values and the Christian beliefs that both of us had, growing up with. It was that still didn't change for either of us. We still held on to that Christian belief, and it was something that you were yearning for, right? That community, that feeling. And I felt it as well. Maybe not nearly as much. I think that can happen with being busy at work. There was this tension where we both were craving spirituality, but we were also wanting the distancing from like the Mormon theology. Kind of like we said before, we wanted to still celebrate Easter, still celebrate the resurrection and what that meant to us, while also, trying to have that separation. It was a difficult thing to balance and to juggle, at least for us.
Well, it's just a new thing too. Like in all of our families, we've only known them to be together. That feeling kind of followed us everywhere, it felt like, at least in the back of our minds. So maybe you can relate, but in our case, when we started deconstructing this high demand religion, we started deconstructing almost everything.
Yeah, you really start like asking like more difficult questions, not because you want to tear things apart, because you honestly want to understand them better. Like you want to start understanding like your role as a person, like starting to question what has been told to you, like it has to happen a certain way, and find out if there's like a better way that suits your situation.
Well, when you grow up in a religion or an organization that gives you the answers for everything, really like values, gender roles, family structures, authority, truth even, and then, you start to realize the story isn't what it seems like or what it was told, like how can you not start to question a lot of things? And it's hard because, like you said, it's not on purpose. We don't want to do this. This is hard. This has been hard. It feels hard. We don't want to have more hard because we're just trying to enjoy Japan. But yet, how can you not? Like your brain almost goes into protection mode. At least for us, it does. Because it hurt to find out that information. And unfortunately, there was just so much information that like it just kept on like chipping away some of our trust in some of the systems in the world.
Yeah, and we weren't just like absorbing anything for truth. Like we were really trying to fact check, do internal checks to see how it like felt. And our intuition is what I was trying to say. Time and time again, we find ourselves in these positions where we're not trying to change or bend the rules to like fit our lifestyle or to fit our like likes or dislikes. But in a way, like we're also trying to be authentic to ourselves. We're trying to become and stay people with like high moral values, being like a good neighbor for the ease of the term, right?
Yeah, I feel like in part, some of our pause happened because we felt like the institution and the religion, the LDS religion, wasn't really aligning with our version of Jesus. Like if we're trying to be like Jesus, ultimately we felt like some of the things were what Jesus would do. Like at that point in Japan, I remember feeling that way. Leaving felt like I was following more of like a Christian way that felt more right.
Yeah, both of us felt more connected to the Christian values and to the teachings that were in the Bible, like what we knew, by making that decision. And it's a little ironic because those who are within the Mormon church, they would say that by doing that, like that's apostasy. It's like being a cafeteria member or like kind of being an apostate. Like you're leaving the righteous path. Like you're not holding on to the proverbial iron rod they talk about in the Book of Mormon. And it is kind of hard because at this time we're also facing the dilemma of like, how is our family going to react to this? Not because of the internal pressure, but like we're part of a big family. Like family is everything within any church, but especially within our experience.
Yeah, because you had voiced in Norway, you didn't see yourself staying in the religion. I do feel like the thoughts of potentially leaving was also on the table,
Yeah.
But even just what would people think of us not going to church? That alone is a big thing. Like that's kind of one of the first steps, of apostatizing, I guess.
I mean, you're not wrong, right? Like the first steps are to, stop going. And in fact, someone had commented on episode 8 and said, well, you guys started traveling a lot. You weren't prioritizing God. You weren't prioritizing going to church. And in some ways, sure, like we weren't going to church every single Sunday, but we were also connecting with, God's creations. We were really connecting with what we consider to be spiritual practices of like connecting with nature, of getting to know deeper about culture and other parts of like life. So in our idea, sure, we weren't going to church every week, but we were still holding within our daily lives all of the things that would be, I guess, required to say yes, like we are still putting a priority for spirituality. It just didn't fit the mold that has been transcribed for others, you know?
And I mean, it clocks because a lot of religions, they don't tell you just what to believe, but like how to think, you know? So I do think that kind of goes with it of like, how often are you going to church? What questions are you having? What is acceptable? What's not acceptable? It makes sense we're going to be getting comments like that because they kind of tell them that's bad.
Yeah.
We even felt some of that guilt and shame ourselves. And in a sense, like, other people, it's easy to think, you know, maybe we're spiritually off track.
Yeah, but it didn't feel that way.
No.
Like in so many other ways, again, we felt like it was a new chapter of our spirituality, and it just looked different than what we had been raised to believe. But all through this time, like, there were proverbial cracks that were starting to happen, and that's where we'll kind of like dive into next, is kind of some of those topics that were probably the most difficult to face. So we're going to start off with kind of a big one, and this is patriarchy. Being a man, I grew up largely blind to a lot of the differences between men and women within society, which we'll touch on in more depth later, but especially within the church. Like, I didn't know what it was like to be told I had to cover up, like we talked about for clothing in other episodes. I didn't know what it was like to not have the priesthood at 12, which was more priesthood than any woman in the church has or ever will have.
And we want to say that we know that patriarchy is not just like our religion specific thing. Happens in the world. It's very clearly in most cultures, religions, organizations. So it's very, very common, but the LDS faith was our religion.
And I did talk about this a little bit more in depth on the previous episode, because I talked about how I was trying to be more in touch with like the Heavenly Mother, or like a feminine divine. And so I'm also beginning just to like recognize how it's not just within like heavenly parents, but also just within like the church structure, and how every decision that's made within the church has to be approved by a man, even if it's all a woman's group and all of the women came up with the idea. It has to like be given the green light.
In a lot of cases, there's a lot of women who would say they have a lot of power and voice within their church calling and within their role. And I love that for them. You know, I hope that's true. It's just when you look at it from the outside in, big picture perspective, right? It's difficult to, like you said, not see the inequality. I believe you if you feel like you have that equality, and I hope that for you. But there's just some things that, like, factually,
yeah, like
there's differences.
How many times in the church will you see a woman make the final decision on what the elders quorum or like the priesthood body gets to do? And even if the bishop, who is a man, decides that the women can make the decision, he's the one that's signing off on things. There always has to be a man presiding for almost every single aspect of like church activities.
Yeah, I mean, even just visually, if you're just sitting in the congregation, you look up and, you know, you see the 3 members of the bishopric. None of them are female. Maybe the Relief Society president joins in very progressive wards, but I feel like that's more the rarity. And I do feel like there's, you know, more individuals talking about representation. But at this point, like, you just don't see a mother giving a blessing, laying their hands on someone's head, even their own kid. Like, there's so many examples we could talk about, but yeah, representation. It's clear to see, even in the high levels of the church, like at the quorum of the 12, look at the quorum of the 70, look at how many women are talking in general conference versus men. Like, there is a disparity. And unfortunately, I feel like growing up, I was pretty immune to it as well, just because that was the normal. So hearing you say you also weren't really affected and you didn't hear it, like, sadly, it's this way, but it's also true that I wasn't recognizing those differences either.
Accepted for what they were.
It was just how it was. It was the normal, the status quo. That's just how it was. And then, yeah, when you start to think about it, you can't really unsee it and you can't really unthink it. And then it becomes more apparent. And looking back, like, I realized for almost the majority of my life that I had been taught how to make myself seem a bit smaller in order to fit in.
Yeah, and like unintentionally, we fell into these patterns of like traditional gender roles, right? So at this time, we happened to be reading a book called Fed Up by Gemma Hartley. It was within like our book club. Honestly, we had like a really good time reading, but it was a difficult read because we were facing like a lot of harsh realities and truths, like even within our own marriage.
Yeah, I started reading it and was like, ooh, this one feels familiar. So the book talks a lot about emotional labor, the invisible labor that most women like are taking on themselves, not just because they want to, but just because that's how the systems are in place. Like they naturally fall on their lap. So we're talking like the planning, the preparing, the gifting, the prepping, the meal making, the organizing, the things that keep life, that keep our societies functioning, that are kind of more invisible. They take up the headspace, but naturally fall on women. And it's not just in families. This is even within like businesses and organizations. And what hits you, at least what hit me when reading this book, is how women are taking on this responsibility without the authority. So a lot of them are taking on these roles, but they're not being viewed as leaders, or they're not being viewed as like the authority figure. In the home, a lot of times, at least in the communities that we grew up in, the male was like the authority and like the head of the household and was calling the shots. Kind of ironic that, you know, women are doing the majority of this, but not really getting the recognition for it.
Yeah, and it kind of followed like the path, like the family proclamation that the church, the LDS church had released was really in a lot of ways a way for them to set the traditional gender roles. You know, the man's purpose was to provide and protect, and the woman's role was to nurture, right? And so, of course, there are anomalies, and there are people who'd say like, you know, I feel fully supported to like be a successful businesswoman or to like have my own business as a woman, and like my husband is a stay-at-home dad, and like there are definitely outliers, and we love to see that, but like as a general whole, so much of that emotional labor that you talked about was invisible labor, and so invisible to me that it's like as you start tallying up all of these extra tasks that are being done, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're right. I never have even thought about that. I am starting to face these harsh realities that like, wow, like without even realizing it, the patriarchal system has allowed me to step into a fairly comfortable lifestyle where I go to work, I come home, I eat food. Yes, I can help out with dishes, put the kids to bed, be like a involved dad. But like there's so much more beyond that, where it's like, you know, booking appointments, birthday cards or whatever. You know, there's lots of things that come to mind, and we're still working on it. Like we're in an ever improving process of ups and downs with sharing these responsibilities. In so many ways, society sets it up, at least within our religious upbringing too, that it was a woman's job where it was to take care of those, to kind of keep the peace and to be the caretaker of the home.
I feel like now we found, you know, a more equal partnership, and we've landed in a really great place. But like you said, it's always changing, especially as our girls get older and their activities change, and, you know, just life changes and you have to adjust to it. So I feel like that's going to be a continuous journey. Taking this book, we were looking at it in two lenses. We were applying it to our personal lives. That definitely was the majority. But like we talked about religiously within the Mormon church, there was a lot that aligned also. I feel like really the backbone of a lot of the Mormon church, the invisible labor, a lot of it really is running on the women. And the thing is, I feel like for a lot of my life, I just felt like that was the way that God wanted it to be. And I would say that's probably how a lot of current active members feel, is they feel like they're really stepping into their role and they don't need that authority, and that's just the way God wants it. And, you know, I would say now that I do feel differently. I feel like it can be okay to both hold the responsibility and both hold the authority.
So as we're like recognizing a lot of these differences, these patterns within like patriarchal systems, we're also asking like, is this truly how the way God wanted it to be? Of course, like we don't have the answer to that. Like we're not going to pretend like we do, but like internally we're starting to see it differently and say, I don't think that it was intended to be so black and white, or to be so unequal in the distribution of so many aspects like you were mentioning before. Of course, like you start to examine it more in history as well too. All of these prophets are men. It's written by men. It's, you know, dictated by what men want. And then you start to just recognize that so much of the narrative and norms were identified and controlled by men. So it kind of makes sense that it would favor them the more.
Yeah, I feel like this season of reading this Fed Up book made me fed up. Maybe your perspective is different listening to this, but I feel like it's really valid to be a woman and to start to recognize that a lot of these systems that happen created for men's advantage by men, it just kind of sucks to be blunt and honest. I don't want to feel angry. Like in this time in our lives in Japan, it's like another thing that we've deconstructed or like had our eyes open to. Like another one, this sucks, this hurts.
And it wasn't even like trying to avoid it or to make life difficult. Again, it was just recognizing that there was something that was very applicable to our lives that felt not right. Like it wasn't right the way that we were currently living. We wanted to make change. And it was a big part of like the religious view that was, again, like you saw it, you read it, you felt it, and there was no way to look at it the same way ever again.
But I do want to say, like, I don't think I ever realized how much invisible labor I was carrying. And I think one of the reasons I didn't recognize it was because it was being praised. Like, it was being seen as, like, being righteous. In the Mormon religion, they highly emphasize getting married, being a mother. And so for me, it was like being praised by being a good mother, by like fulfilling those kind of expectations. So when I'm feeling overwhelmed or overworked, I'm not really thinking, oh my gosh, something's wrong with this system. I'm thinking, I need to just do my job better. I need to be a better mom. I need to figure out why this is so hard for me. Even just yesterday, do you remember me showing you a text of like this group I'm in with women here in Italy? They're sharing their feelings of being constantly tired and feeling exhausted. And everyone is relating. And I love the vulnerability. I love the honesty as a woman. We need each other. So to have one woman be so honest and vulnerable, it feels very validating. But because of going through this process, also, when I hear this and I read it, my heart hurts because I'm kind of viewing it now of like, something's wrong with this system, Like, I'm sure the males in their life are also probably feeling tired. I don't know the backstory, but it does make me question, why is it that most of the invisible labor is just naturally falling on women?
Yeah, throughout this whole time, we were having quite difficult conversations. We were trying to find out what best aligned with like our goals and like what felt right for us. Splitting up tasks was not about 50-50, but more about like what was logistically going to be the best for us, how we were going to best support each other. It was hard for me. Like even still to this day, there are things that I'm like, crap, I forgot to think about like that invisible piece of labor, but I have taken on a lot of other things that have made me more grateful and aware of all that's going on. Hopefully, I think you've expressed it a few times, hopefully has made it feel more balanced.
Yeah, I think it was nice to just feel like both of our times were valued more equally and that we could split them up in a way that felt great for us. Although it came with, like you said, so many hard conversations and some rocky moments for sure. We came out stronger because of it. And for me, our relationship has far more depth and meaning to it, knowing that you're in those moments. You're thinking of the in-between tasks that need to be had. And it just feels like a more meaningful relationship.
Ditto. And this is a lot. Like there are so many aspects of life that are changing for us right now. We're still adjusting to a new culture, to a new language, to a new job, eventually a new school for Willa. So yeah, we had to take breaks. We like could not physically just be going all the time, talking about all of these difficult conversations all the time.
Yeah, it was definitely like a little bit at a time. How much can one person's like mind and brain take without it really affecting their mental state,
Mm-hmm. Once we eventually did pick back up to try and navigate through like this faith expansion, we kind of landed into the gospel topic essays again. We had mentioned this in the last episode, but the gospel topic essays were a series of essays aimed at providing more light and history and transparency to some difficult conversations within like the church doctrine and history.
Very important to like gospel topic essays on LDS Church website.
Some of the last topics were polygamy, the Book of Mormon translation, and some of the newer ones that we were reading were about race and the priesthood, about the Book of Abraham, which we'll touch on in a little bit here. But a lot of these topics, the moral of the story is so many of them were being brought up by previous church members in like the mid to late 1900s. They were trying to shed light on these important documents, historical events, whatever it may be, to say like, hey, this is actually what happened, and the message that you're teaching, church, what you're teaching is not true. And unfortunately, some of the hardest things to hear was that there were several members who, in one part or another, they were excommunicated or disfellowshipped from the church for shedding light on these topics, only for the church decades later to come out and publish and say that these things actually happened. Like so many of these topics that were shared and are published today were viewed as like anti-Mormon material. And there's like really no argument around that. Like I know some people will say that evidence was always there and it was always available, but before the internet, like it wasn't. Like people had to really look to find them.
And it's a bummer how the church responded to it, because there really has never been no apology made from it. Like it's very similar to the SEC case that we talked about in episode 8. And it is unfortunate to see the response from the church.
Yeah, you just would have hoped in one way or another that there would be this modeling of accountability and like remorse, much like we're taught, like the steps to repentance, right? Really showing that you're repenting is showing that you've made the decision to acknowledge that you made a mistake. You make your wrongs right with anyone who's been affected, which would be your entire church membership. But anyway, I get maybe it's in some ways people are thinking that's too picky, but for me, it fits right in with like how we're supposed to live as Christians. Like that felt right. The gospel topics essay were some difficult like things to read, although they provided clarity and I feel like it's a good step in the right direction. It was also difficult because it felt like it was in response to a lot of criticism rather than, hey, we identified that this wasn't right and we're fixing it.
Yeah, and at this time, I started to listen to more podcasts that were related to the Mormon church and theology. And I remember particularly one episode that has really stuck with me and was like a big shelf breaker for the Book of Mormon. It actually started talking about the second anointing, oddly enough, which is a doctrine that not a lot of members maybe know about. At least I didn't.
It's not talked about often because it's discouraged to talk about it.
I think there's maybe a reference in the Book of Mormon or maybe the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah.
Don't remember ever going in depth, even in like seminary class where you study in depth the books. I don't remember that.
I'm sure that there are classes that they talk about it, but it's a very special ritual event where elect or selected members are chosen to receive what they call a second blessing or a second anointing, which essentially guarantees them that they will reach the highest kingdom of heaven, which there are 3 in Mormon theology. And it's basically saying like, we are acting as a judge for you and saying that you're going to like reach this highest level of heaven, unless of course like you commit murder or you deny the Holy Ghost. So it's like a pretty big statement to say, basically, this is your judgment. We're giving you your judgment right now. And by receiving this blessing, you're guaranteed a spot in heaven. It was like, wait, what? As you learn more about this, it seems very secretive. It seems very elitist. And in some ways, it just felt wrong to be hearing about it.
Yeah, I remember being surprised as the first reaction. And then secondly, following up with kind of like the ick. Like this just feels like something my version of my God and like my perception of like the Mormon Heavenly Father that I believed in, something that he wouldn't do, you know? I mean, at this point, I already don't believe in the 3 kingdoms of heaven. So then to like believe in a God that would promise someone the top kingdom of heaven, just, yeah, it felt, like I said, icky is kind of like the word that best aligns. In this podcast, this guy and his wife received the second anointing. It's something that takes place in the LDS temples in, I think, rooms, maybe ceiling rooms that maybe aren't used with the other public.
To the public, yeah.
he had a very high calling at this time. Most individuals who are selected are in positions with higher power within the church, from my understanding. Years later in his journey, starts having questions about the Book of Mormon. And so what he does is he writes a letter to the historians at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And he asks them if there's any archaeological evidence that support the Book of Mormon. And they respond back saying 0%, not 0.1%, not 0.05%, like zero. Like there is not any.
And I think you were surprised to hear this because it was like you have archaeological experts, archaeologists that spend their lives dedicating and like researchers, and the Book of Mormon's been around for a long enough time that at this point, you would think that there would be some sort of evidence of like, millions of people dying in a certain geographical location in the Americas, and, the geographical locations being described.
Like in the Book of Mormon, they're talking about, a family that's leaving from Jerusalem going to the Americas. Like surely other historians have some sort of evidence about this, or it's written in other books. But according to the experts at the Smithsonian, there's like zero archaeological evidence. And honestly, I feel like that's when a lot of my shelf broke on the Book of Mormon as well. Growing up, the Book of Mormon was not just like this inspirational book. It was a book that was sharing stories of people in history, like real stories, real people, real factual events. That's how I always grew up learning and knowing about it. And not only that, but it was like the foundation. Like we talked about it in the previous episode, how like the Book of Mormon is like the keystone to the religion. And I do remember growing up in primary, like songs about the Book of Mormon, like Book of Mormon stories that my teacher tells to me, all about the Lamanites in ancient history. Like there's like signs far across the something and da 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 da. Given this land if he lives righteously. There was actions, there was stories. It was something that happened.
Yeah, we were taught to believe that they were historical facts for decades, like all during the time that we were growing up reading this. The introduction of the Book of Mormon said that the Lamanites, one of the group of the two peoples, the two most popular people that they were talking about, they were principal ancestors of the American Indians. Like that's what we were taught for so long. Like that's what we believed. But then to come find out, very subtly, they made a change that said in 2006 that they were no longer the principal ancestors, but they were among the ancestors. And then on top of it, the church later comes out with, I believe it's actually part of the Gospel Topics essays, where they talk about DNA evidence and the Book of Mormon, right? Like science has an incredible ability to be able to trace back like DNA and heritage and like immigration patterns and like where people come from. Even now, like the church comes out and they word it very carefully to say that there's no way to disprove, but there's no way to prove that like people coming from the Middle East, coming from Israel, over to the Americas, like in fact they're saying many of their ancestors are from a blend, but in fact, a lot of them coming from Asia. Now it seems to be that there are these very convenient changes to the narrative, which wouldn't be an issue if that was the way that it was initially taught. If it was a book and stories full of good morals and values, following, stories that taught people how to follow Christ and God, like that would be okay because it still has the same effect of trying to draw people to be more Christ-like. But when it's being taught to be a literal translation of a historical record, translated through the power of God, and now the narrative is changing in a quite pivotal moment, like that I feel like was a really crumbling point for what is supposed to be the keystone of the religion. Like the trust is crumbling at that point.
Yeah, and right here I want to say, like, we're not sharing this information to mock or point out anyone's beliefs that they may have still about the Book of Mormon. Not at all. We know that for many people, the Book of Mormon still holds such deep meaning and truth for them. For us, though, realizing that these historical claims have changed over time and that there isn't any archaeological evidence to support it, that did change. And like that was a really big thing for me.
And faith is still an important part of our lives at this time. Like there is some aspect where seeing isn't believing. Like, we understand that. And the same could be said about the Bible, right? There are a lot of things that show evidence of certain aspects of what's in the Bible. And so it was more of just realizing that the historicity was being less and less a focus after it had been claimed and touted as being the most correctly translated book ever, even more than the Bible, then to come find out that the members need to focus on more of the spiritual aspects of the book rather than its historicity.
And that's what you'll find online. At least that's what I find when I look more into the Book of Mormon stuff, is there's this big debate. You're getting historians, maybe researchers, scientists that are saying, this is the evidence, this is what it stands. And then you have the church that is being careful with their wording to address some of the DNA discrepancies, but strongly emphasizing it's important to read for the spiritual gain. And so I think anyone can take that from either perspective. If you want to read the Book of Mormon for spiritual gain and enlightenment as like a book of inspiration for you, like, that is awesome. It's one of many amazing, inspirational, enlightening spiritual books out there. That was a big moment, I feel like, for me.
So now it's pretty obvious, like, we're in Japan. We haven't mentioned anything about the religious aspect of moving to a non-Christian country per se. So we want to talk about that.
Yeah, when we first moved to Japan, I had no intentions of questioning Christianity at all. That was not on my thought process, because I knew that although I was deconstructing Mormonism, I did think I would land somewhere within the realms of Christianity. Because for us, Mormonism always just felt like the more true version of Christianity, just like more correct than the other religions. And so deconstructing it, it was just like, oh, I'm just going back a step. And honestly, being exposed to so many other religions in Japan that were not Christian, that's the emphasis, that were not Christian, actually did make us have some questions.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a little about some of them, but a lot of it was just having our eyes opened again to just how people worship in such different ways, and how some people worship multiple gods, some people don't worship a god at all, and some people worship a god that feels very similar to a Christian God. You know what I mean? And so as we went to Shinto temples, went to different Buddhist temples, we would see people going there and being intentionally with their spirituality, going into saying the prayers. We'd learn about what each of the claps meant, about what the symbolism of the coin meant in an offering. It was kind of like opening up this door of separating spirituality from religion in a very applicable, very tangible way for us. It still felt very scary, I would say, to even try to think about what that would look like, because again, both of us still feel like at this point Christianity feels like the most correct. It's the most comfortable that we've been living with. But then we continually ask ourselves those questions. There's around 1/3 of the world that is would identify as Christian believing. But then that means there's 2/3 of the world,
The
majority of the world's population that has a different insight, that doesn't fully believe in the Christian setup. I guess that's for lack of a better term. And so we just start to really think about how more of these morals and values are what really people overlap the most of, right? Being kind, being generous, thoughtful, grateful, all of these Christ-like attributes, they're found everywhere else. They just have a different meaning. They just have maybe a slightly different name and a different way of being expressed. It was quite eye-opening.
Yeah, for us growing up in the U.S., Christianity just kind of felt universal. It's woven into the religions. It's woven into our communities especially.
Woven into the Constitution of many Western societies,
Yeah, there's so many ideas of what a good life is, and Christianity was definitely woven into that. But in Japan, it's just one tradition among many others. So once you see that and you live in a place where Christianity isn't just assumed, it is very eye-opening, like you said, and we start to realize that for us, what was truth, again, we're realizing this, might just be more of a cultural thing. And it might just be a thing that is practiced because of where you're born.
Yeah, that's one thing that we have mentioned before in like other, I think, YouTube videos, maybe podcast episodes. We've had the conversation quite a few times where it's so interesting to think that the religion you practice and that you are raised with is almost purely indicated by your geographical place of birth. Or if you do move, like where you move to. If you're born in Japan, like there's a very high chance that you're either practicing Buddhism or you're practicing Shintoism. If you're born in like a Western country, Christianity is most likely what you want. Like if you're born in India, like there's Hinduism. If you're born in an Islamic country, like obviously Islam is going to be a higher chance that your family is going to be practicing that.
Yeah. And for us, being able to recognize it in one hand felt really nice because I feel like we're getting this big world perspective and a worldview that comes with so much growth and like a deeper understanding of how the world works. And on the other hand, it's absolutely terrifying because Christianity and Mormonism is all that we've known. And we put all of our eggs into that basket. And so to put it in the perspective that might make it seem like it's not true, even Christianity, it's just like it wasn't where I thought it was going to land.
And it wasn't whether or not like it was true. It was just like whether or not it was the right way in the way that we were trained and taught to believe, right? Everyone's goal was like very similar, being able to reach the happiest points and moments of our life, to have a family, or to not, but like to be in a community where you're being a person with good moral values. You're doing your best to try and make life like the best that you possibly can. And if the end result of an afterlife looks very similar for all these religions and it just happens to have like a different definition, maybe we really are all chasing the same thing. Over years of stories, over years of traditions, over preferences, like that's how religions were formed, and like that's just how it played out. You just start to kind of question to see like how that feels. And yeah, it is scary. What's scary?
Yeah, and this is what's happening for us in Japan, right? Is we're starting to have this worldview of like why people believe the things that they do. And in turn, we're starting to realize that I think is important to really say and address. We start to realize the benefit that religion has on cultures, on societies, as humans, right? Because for a lot of people, this is the place where they're finding their moral compass. Whoever they're believing in most religions is, saying what's good and what's bad and what's okay and what's not. And there's a lot of benefit to that in communities. We benefited from it. We lived that. We could relate with that. We don't deny that. We think religion has so much value and there's so much good there, and like a shared language of love and meaning and purpose. And we've experienced some harm in our journey with Mormonism, like we've shared with you in previous podcasts. In this episode, we've just shared some of the reasons why it's been hard. But I do feel like we're starting to see here living in Japan, like religion doesn't have to be harmful. It doesn't have to be hurtful. So here we are separating morals from religion, because there's a lot of people in Japan as well that are just living morally, like high moral lives. Japan showed us that God or any particular religion doesn't hold the claim of good morals and values. And I know that might be like a duh to so many of you listening here, but for me, when I realized that with my Mormon God, it was a big light bulb. And then to be in Japan and have it reinforced again, it just formed our new perspective that humans, us, can be innately good, morally driven people without even the guise or direction of one particular religion.
Yeah. And this is all very heavy, right? Like I know many of you have commented and said, your Christian beliefs have been like foundational, right? Whether, leaving or joining, it's been an impactful part of your life. And that's why for us, this was a very difficult one to even navigate and even to have come across our minds. And like, although it's been difficult, part of like what's been nice is we've started to view the morals more distinctly as a responsibility rather than a requirement or like a commandment coming from somebody. It's just the innate ability to recognize that we have the responsibility to be someone who holds high morals for ourselves, for our daughters, for our community, you know? And so that distinction has been pretty impactful for us to be more intentional with so many things that we do in life. It's the same goal and the same result. It's just a different, I think, intention when you go about it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of understanding from us on all perspectives, right? Like we totally see how religion can be the best pathway for someone to maybe live a life that's maybe more mindful of others or more service oriented, or, is looking outside of themselves a little bit more. I totally think that that could be the right path for so many people. And living in Japan again, I also feel like it's very possible for people who grow up in a nurturing environment to have all those same morals and values without the direction of a religion. Who we are today is, I feel like, who we were back then with a lot of our morals and values. But for me now, it does feel more meaningful because I'm not doing it because someone has told me I have to, or because it's a commandment or whatever. It's just because I want to be a kind human being, and I feel like what I do impacts other people and it makes a difference. And strangely enough, like this has felt more meaningful to me, to us.
I think it's a change of perspective because although I fully agree with you there, but I do feel like some people see it as kind of like a 2-for-1, right? Like they find that deep meaning and deep drive to be a good high moral individual regardless of the commandment. It's just something that they hold very valuable to them as well, and it's like a double, like I said, a 2-for-1.
Okay, so deep conversations, meaningful topics, but we are going in depth here, and this is going to continue as we segue. The next thing we want to talk about is prayer and how our journey of prayer has kind of changed and evolved, and what it looked like in Japan. So, of course, all of these new perspectives and way of thinking change how we related to God. So it's probably halfway through our time in Japan where we changed the frequency of our prayers. So we didn't stop entirely, but the frequency lessened, and noticeably lessened.
We started asking ourselves like kind of deeper questions about what we were praying for. Like, what was the purpose of the prayer? Was it to be grateful for the food more times often than not? Was it to ask for a blessing on the food? Absolutely. But like we start asking ourselves these questions of like seeing some pretty heavy stuff on like the news, seeing like so many inequalities and disparities across multiple countries. And it started to ask the question like, okay, well, these people are Islamic or these people are Christian, but like their country is being torn apart right now. There's a famine in this African country. I bet that they're praying too. I bet that they're asking for blessings. I bet that they're expressing gratitude to God. It forces you to ask yourself, is me praying, asking for this specific thing, truly going to change the outcome of like what I'm eating, about being able to get the next meal, about a number of things, when the same person who might be more faithful or more earnest in their prayers, like they can't get the basic needs that they need strictly because of where they are. And it's like, is that because God isn't listening to their prayers, but he is mine, when that person clearly needs more need? It kind of brought up that whole idea about an intervening God within prayer.
Yeah, we definitely struggled with the idea of a God who would intervene in, small, trivial ways for some, especially those that are believing God is intervening in those ways, while remaining silent for those in unimaginable scenarios. Like, I know this is deep. When you think about that, it was hard for us. And so because of these thoughts, for me, actually, I would say my reason for decreasing prayers was intentional. I had to work through that, and I had to decide what I believed in. And so here I am, and I'm feeling the loss of this framework of prayer. I missed that ritual, and I missed the moments of gratitude. I missed the stillness that praying provides. I miss the familiarity, So now here we are in Italy and we figured out what prayer looks like for us. And we're going to get to that in future episodes.
Yeah, those two were pretty heavy. Obviously, we're sharing with you some of our initial thoughts of like exploring faith and religion outside of like what we were truly raised and brought up in. And again, to emphasize, like this was all with the intention of trying to understand better our faith by getting down to the roots and to the foundation. Like you're forced to ask yourself like those deep questions of what you truly believe and look at the foundational supports. And so all during these times, we eventually get to the point where we're wanting to find out some more. One thing that's very common for people who are going through faith crisis is they try to find commonalities between other people, what they've experienced. It's exactly what we did. As we're reading about all of these gospel topics essays, part of the podcast have mentioned probably dozens of times over the years about something called the CES letter. CES stands for Church Education System. And so there was an individual who wrote a letter to the CES trying to ask difficult questions. I know many people feel like he was just like a disgruntled member who was trying to stir up things and make like a name for himself. But I truly believe that there was so much intention going behind this to try and find truth and to also try and ask the church to become more accountable for things. All around a very similar time, the CES letter and the gospel topics essays like were in very close proximity within a few years of each other. Anyway, this document highlights many concerns and questions within Mormon doctrine, historical records, and they highlight almost every single one of them that are covered in the gospel topics essays. And so we decided to begin reading it, right, to see what more questions and what more concerns there were, because maybe there were some things that we hadn't thought of before. Not only because of that, but we just wanted to hear and see different perspectives.
Yeah, I feel like at this time, I actually didn't even need to read it. I feel like I was rounding out some of my deconstruction journey a little bit, right? Wouldn't it be safe to say like, you know, at this point, we're even starting to have new perspectives of God and Christianity. So like Mormonism, some of this was being deconstructed as much as it could be. For me, I had purposely put off reading the CS letter because I knew it was like the shelf breaker, like the final straw for a lot of people who had chosen to leave the religion. And I wasn't at a place emotionally or mentally where I wanted to have that happen. And so I felt like, you know, when we decided to read it, I was kind of already to that point. And I thought, yeah, I want to know what else is out there and, you know, what is in this thing that is reason for leaving for so many people. And actually, once we started reading it, I was surprised to find out a lot of information that I didn't at that point know about.
Now, we won't go over like all of the topics that go in there because it's a lot, like there's a lot of documents. But one of them in particular, again, kind of tied back to, again, like the translation of the Book of Mormon. And one of the records that Joseph Smith was said to have translated was called the Book of Abraham. Even the Book of Abraham is talked about in like the gospel topics essays. The most alarming thing to find out is that this Book of Abraham, which is still considered scripture as far as I'm concerned today, it was like a papyrus. The church, in the early years, the church had bought this papyrus, or papyrus, however you say it. Joseph Smith claimed to have translated it. You can still see like all of what the translations meant. It's in the book called The Pearl of Great Price. But this was supposed to be like, again, proof or evidence that Joseph Smith was like being inspired and he was able to translate this scroll. Come to find out, this scroll was completely wrong. Egyptologists and professional experts in the field are saying there's like no overlap to this. It wasn't helping the argument.
So we read about half of the CES letter, maybe a little bit less. It's kind of like the proverbial like peak of like this whole journey of us finding out all this information. And this is like one of the last things. Around this time, I remember watching Johnny Harris's YouTube video about his journey, experience, and thoughts on the Mormon Church and its history. One of the comments in there said, when talking about the LDS Church, It said, "It's like growing up in a warm, cozy cabin with a roaring fireplace, but then stepping outside into the frigid cold night and turning around to see that there was no warm cabin in the first place." I could relate to that feeling. And I would say reading the CES letter just kind of confirmed that feeling even more. Just realize there's a lot that doesn't match up. There's a lot that's different. It's hard to look back and to have this feeling and impression of the church and to physically remember what it felt like to sit in the church pews, to sing songs with other like-minded individuals, to feel so warm and cozy with your family. And then to get to this point years later, it's hard. Overall, this journey has taken us to a place where my perspective is so different now, and I can't unsee it.
Yeah. To make things a little bit more difficult at this time, we had made a trip back to Utah where you were planning on visiting your grandpa because he wasn't doing well, and you and the girls were going to go because we knew at this point that we were going to be leaving soon to go back to Europe. I was going to be busy with work, and I decided I was going to stay back. Unfortunately, at this time, my grandpa fell very ill and he passed away. Coincidentally, it happened to be the same day that you guys were flying out. So last minute, I decided to join. It just felt like one of those moments that despite everything else that was going on, like it was going to be the best thing. So I booked a flight, and 12 hours later, we were on the plane. And during all of the funeral arrangements, the meeting up with family and stuff, because my grandparents and parents and most of my family are still very much active within the LDS church, it was everywhere, which honestly, growing up, felt just so normal and comfortable. But I think being away from it for so long and then stepping into this and then going to, the church where we had the funeral. Just remember this moment when we were standing over the casket and the local church leader over that was presiding over the funeral was talking to all of the little kids, like including Willa. He said, "Kids, like, look, he's wearing his temple clothes." And you know what that means? That means that he was following the commandments. That means that he was living the life like he was supposed to, and that he's going to be able to live in heaven. He's setting up this example for all of you to follow, to be able to do the same and keep your family together.
Yeah, and something in me broke again watching that. Not because we don't believe in an afterlife, but because love, specific temple clothes, connection, even a reunion, were being framed as like conditional. They were being framed on like dependent of certain rituals, clothing, ordinances, worthiness. And that moment just crystallized something for me again, like it's not an abstract thing for our family. Mormonism will always be in our life. Like it's played a huge part in our life, and we're so grateful for most of it. But now, as we shared, our beliefs are changing. We can't step away from the things that we don't believe in because it's here, it's tangible, it's being talked to our daughters of how and what steps are needed in order for her to see her great grandpa again. It hurts and it hits. For one, it hits hard, where it's just like this perspective of like, this could be around her more often if we chose it to be. But like now being in this environment where it is here and it is around us, I'm feeling like this isn't aligning.
Yeah, it was a difficult realization to have because in that moment, we truly only wanted just to focus on family. We only wanted to focus on being there to celebrate the life of my grandpa, such an incredible role model. And yeah, like it was not tainted by any means. It was not tainted, but it was the realization that there was so much of our beliefs that had changed. There was so much of what had felt normal and right for us that had changed.
Yeah, I think it was just a realization, again, that just kind of hit you with these instances, And so we left Utah with the growing awareness that staying in this religion would require us to silence some parts of ourselves, our questions, our values, even our instincts as parents and what we want to teach our kids. She's going to be told a way that's not necessarily aligning with us if we choose to still stay. And so, like, what came next? So I am emotional now. However, actually, on the flight home, I think you finished reading the CS letter. I got home and shortly after finished reading it. We made a very non-emotional decision to kind of say out loud with everything that we've been through, and especially this most recent experience being back in Utah. I think it just kind of solidified like this isn't aligning anymore, and we don't want to be a part of the Mormon religion anymore.
And it still came with like emotion, but the decision seemed more clear. I think we both agree like it was still an inevitable decision that we felt was best for us, but it was sped up a little bit because of the drastic difference of like the life that we had been living, and then going back to realize this used to be very normal for us, and seeing how much distance had come between those two versions of ourselves was, I think, the realization that we needed to make that decision to say it out loud. It still came with a lot of heavy weight. It still came with a lot of decisions to later on, between 6 and 9 months later, to eventually share with our siblings and parents. But like at that point, we were very much on that same page of that was like our departure. The accumulation of all of those experiences, like you had mentioned, the expansion of our faith, the desire to get deeper, the difficult history in the past, just all of these desires to like grow eventually is what led us to leave, to make that decision.
And I would say our lived experience in Germany, our lived experience in Japan, like living abroad, having distance away from Mormonism was for sure a factor in our story and where we've ended up now. And some people have asked, like, do you think you would have still experienced, a faith deconstruction, faith expansion if we would have still been in Utah? And I do think the answer is yes. I just think it would have came slower, and I do think it would have came with more complexities. Our leaving wasn't about less goodness. In fact, it was the opposite. It was about wanting more honesty, more compassion, more trust in ourselves, more stepping into who we are becoming. And ultimately, we realized if we wanted our kids to learn about God, to learn about love, to learn about humanity, we wanted it to be expansive, not fear-based. So yeah, slowly but surely we just said out loud what, had kind of been building up, like we said.
It was not one singular event, but hundreds of events over several years. We reached that decision and that point, and honestly, it was a good direction. It was a good step. It was this final ability to allow ourselves to say it out loud and to accept that's the decision that we were making. I feel like in life, so much stress and so much energy goes into weighing out options and decisions that once you make a decision, there comes a moment of like relief and you get to inspect it. It was a difficult time period to experience, but like we grew so much from it. We continue to see a lot of benefit on making that decision today.
Yeah, I am grateful that it did feel so right and grounded, because leaving does kind of come at a cost. But even with all of that, like we chose us. We chose to live a life that felt most authentic to us and that aligned with what we want for our lives, especially for our daughters' lives. And I am proud of us.
So at this point, it's kind of like new territory for us. Like we don't have a spiritual framework that we're working with. And there's like a lot of new ground that we're going to be navigating. And we'll talk about that more in the next episode, more of our reconstruction phase, trying to establish what new normals look for us. But to end out this, we wanted to just share some final thoughts.
Yeah, for the first time in our lives, we felt like we didn't have all the answers. And instead of that feeling terrifying, it actually felt very freeing. And it felt really good to not feel like I knew. Something that I actually hold really close to my heart and is special to me is that the decision for us to leave the church is something that we just kept to ourselves for like half a year. Like it felt really special to have 6 months where the wonder of the world was enough for us. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of people were wondering where we stood spiritually and religiously. Like we just kept that privately to ourselves, and we felt like there was plenty to explore, plenty to stand in awe at without religion telling us what to believe. Especially as we're just gearing up to move to Italy, like a completely new country on, again, the other side of the world. And we're starting this new chapter of our book, especially in our spiritual lives. And it's really exciting, a reconstruction era of sorts. So stay tuned for that next episode as we're going to dive into that. We really, really appreciate you guys being here. Your support means a lot. We'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. Yes, even the good and the bad, we're there for it all. And we just appreciate you making it to the end if you did.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.
Ciao, ciao.